You're involved with the special effects department of BBC television.
That's right, for my sins, yes.
And at the moment you're primarily involved with the Doctor Who series. Is that correct?
Well, this does take most of our time. We have a group of about 8 designers, and each designer has a team of 2. Overall, I suppose there's about 30 of us. And obviously, as you can imagine, Doctor Who is one of the most demanding programs to supply all the needs, effects, sets, special props. So really, Doctor Who, yes, it does take up more time than any other show.
Must be a pretty rewarding sort of job, a very challenging one, I should think.
Can be. I find that so often we might do a certain effect, and obviously the budgeting is the hardest part of it, because it's marvellous to read a script and say, yes, I'd love to do it this way. But we then find that the producer can't give us enough money. So we normally sort of cut things down a bit, and eventually we might even make it too gory, and then it's cut out at the last moment. But it is rewarding in the sense that it's probably our best shop window. We supply effects to about 18 programs a week, but it's really Doctor Who that's the shop window for our department. People remember Doctor Who where they forget other effects and other programs.
And what would you say are the biggest problems you've come across? For instance, the miniaturization, perhaps, of waves and water and fire must be a bit of a headache.
Fire is not so much of a problem as water. It's very difficult to scale down water. You need vast tanks, which we just don't have at the BBC. The best tank for special effects work is in Malta, but of course we don't have that sort of budget. That was a specially built tank for special effects work. No, water is a problem, but I think one's got to remember there's a certain amount of license. If you see an explosion in the water, all right, you have rather large droplets because we shoot at a very high speed. It adds something rather than loses something. All right, people say it's a cheat, but there is no other way of doing it. You can help it a bit by dropping a little bit of detergent, which breaks down the water tension, which helps the scale. That and sort of very fine sprays, the old garden implements for watering flowers and so on, if worked under pressure, for rain and so on with miniatures.
And you were telling me earlier that prior to going to the BBC, you were with the very famous and well-known Hammer Films.
Oh, yes.
You must have learnt a terrific amount from their studios.
Yes, well, I was lucky enough, after leaving Art College in Rochester, and having no luck at all with any of the film studios, eventually finishing up at Bray near Windsor, which was at that time the home of Hammer, and that was in 1960. It's a long time ago now. Anyway, I went in there sort of more or less as a sort of general dog's body and tea boy. Rather interesting if you've got time, John, to listen to this one. I was very depressed when leaving Art College, knowing always what I wanted to do. And I think when you leave school and so on, you think about ambitions and so on. And I had no real guidance of how to get into films or television. All they seemed in those days at college was turning out people to become teachers. And I knew that wasn't for me. And so anyway, I wrote 75 letters and got nowhere. Eventually, they said yes, the art director would like to give me an interview at Bray. So this really made my week. I couldn't wait for this interview to start. And caught the train, arrived at Windsor, and what was I, a young boy of 19. I had a quick half pint of beer in the local station bar, and it was a very hot day, and I think that beer was a little off because I felt really ill, and I had to catch this bus and eventually got to the studio after walking about 2 miles because the bus doesn't actually go past the studio, and I had all my work in a big suitcase. I must have looked a very peculiar sort of salesman type, you know, young, inexperienced salesman. Got into the studio, and they said, oh yes, well, thank you very much for showing me all your work, but we haven't got a job for you. And with that, the special effects man came down into the art department, and he also looked at the work, and again he said, interesting, but you haven't had any training, and we can't afford to train people in films. You either know it or you don't know it. And I began to feel rather faint, and I started to wobble a bit, and they'd been plying me with cigarettes and coffee and everything, and I was swaying, and I must have looked sort of, I'm rather thin in build anyway, and suddenly I remember the special effects man saying, my God, we'll have to give this boy a job, otherwise he's going to die on us. And so that's how it started, and I was virtually paid nothing, but it was still heaven to me. I was sort of sweeping the floors and watching what was going on, and that's how it all started.
And you progressed to special effects with Hammer, did you?
Yes, yes. Well, at that time, a freelance special effects man, Les Bowie, dear Les, he was the boss. He also worked on other pictures, because a lot of the special effects in a Hammer film would only take perhaps a month to prepare, and then would all be done in 1 week. Now, on an 8-week picture, one is soon one has to look for other work at the same time. So after doing my first film at Bray, we then went to Shepperton on the day the earth caught fire, and that was a very valuable film as far as experience was concerned. I remember having to dry up the Thames, making it look completely as if there was no water in the Thames at all. This was, without giving too much away, it was done by a sort of photographic montage, and the usual dry ice and smoke and loads of fog. We had to fill up the B stage at Shepperton with fog every morning, much to the annoyance of all the actors. Actually, we do put, we use a vegetable oil in our smoke guns, and it's scented with lavender for any temperamental artists, so that it doesn't affect the chest at all, but a lot of them think that it might, the ones with their valuable voices, especially opera singers, they're the worst.
Yeah. So then from Hammer, you went on to the Beeb, did you?
No. I was sort of in and out of work, as so many people that freelance are. It's a bit like being an actor in the film business, in the sense that you work on a picture and then you're thrown to the four winds. So it was sort of 2 weeks on a picture, or on one particular part of a picture, and then probably a week down at the local labour exchange in Chatham, and then the phone would go and I'd go back again. And around about 64, Jerry Anderson, who had been doing some very successful puppet series, such as Supercar and Stingray, was in the middle of writing the first draft of scripts for Thunderbirds, which of course we all know was very, very successful. And I went to him for 2.5 years, as had my own unit in those days, sort of second unit, directing effects. And very hard work. We used to work till about 11 o'clock at night, I remember, and what money we made we could never ever spend, you know. It was that bad every weekend. But great fun.
Now, a lot of the work you were showing me earlier must verge on the realms of makeup as well.
Oh yes, it's very difficult in effects to sort of where one department stops and another department takes over. In makeup, we're sometimes required to make masks, hideous masks, or I can remember, what was it, about 18 months ago, being involved with one particular actor who was playing Caesar, and for the opening credits they wanted blood to appear on his forehead and to dribble down his face, and then for the face to crack. Now that's not really a makeup job, it's more a special effects job. So we made a mask of this actor, made it in wax, and had a rubber skin behind so that we could pull it on cue and it would crack the wax, and well, I think it worked actually, and of course we had the blood dripping down over the forehead.
And apart, of course, from the obvious skill in being an artist, I think you've got to have a very vivid sense of imagination as well.
Yes, one's always aware of trying to think up new ideas, but credit must go to the scriptwriters, because they are the ones that initially write the idea, and then it's up to us to translate it to the screen in a visual way. Usually we all have a sort of, well, in fact always, we always have a meeting before a program, and we thrash out ideas, and until we're all agreed upon what we all want. So often people that write admit themselves that they don't see visually, in the same way that visual people don't see things in words. And so normally one does a few little thumbnail sketches, as we call them, and says, "Is this what you mean?" And they'll say, "No," or "Yes," and so then we know where we are.
How much of the horror effects would you say are in the minds of the audience or in the hands of the lighting technicians? I'm referring, of course, to some of the really horrifying things you showed me earlier. they don't look half too bad in daylight. On the
mean
Doctor
like
Who, well, the
like
bat, the Quatermass,
hand,
thing, yes.
Well, again, it's teamwork. Any effect is a combination of the skills of the lighting man, the cameraman, and even, of course, the sound man. We can do a large bang, for example, a soft pyrotechnic, as we call it, which sometimes gives a large report, other times not. But it's up to the sound man to edit in a louder bang sometimes than was actually recorded at the time, and this will give greater impact. And of course we keep some of the bangs down as far as blast is concerned for safety of the actors.
Do you think the ladies will be extremely frightened of these bats that we do see flying around the screen, but lying here beside us look very inoffensive?
They're peaceful little things, aren't they? They're great friends of mine. I've had them for a long time now.
Now, earlier on you told me you worked on the film 10 Rillington Place with Richard Attenborough. You didn't work on the film?
No, I didn't. I was just showing you some stills.
I
have, John, you see, vast collections of reference in scrapbooks and things, and anything that interests me, I just sort of shove into those books.
I see.
It's back to the old business. If you can't find a book on your favourite subject, you can make your own. So, I keep sort of odd stills and press cuttings and bits and pieces, anything that's relevant to what I'm interested in at the time.
I must say at this point, your scrapbooks are extremely interesting. You've been going through them for 2 or 3 hours.
I didn't bore you too much, John, because I think I started when I was about 13. That was a long time ago. And as you can see, there's about 75 of the things now.
Well, they're so varied, I don't think anyone can be bored. They cover virtually everything.
Well, I do sometimes find they are worth looking at when especially professionally, an argument crops up, and they say, who did that, or what did that look like? And I can normally go to one of these books and find out, especially on the science fiction or the horror side, how it was, when it was. And,
what sort of programs or films give you the most satisfaction to produce? The, shall we say, the horror type, or the sort of the Doctor Who type of thing?
Yes, well, I know that it's always popular to call a horror film, or even on television, a horrific make-up, but we tend to, in the game, always sort of call them fantasy, because they are fantasy. Horror is real. Horror is a road accident. Now that's if you see that and gawk at that, that becomes nauseating. When we do it for stage or theatre, in inverted commas, it is theatre. And we never really forget that it's theatre. I mean, you've seen the make-up blood we use. Well, it's sort of, as we call it, Kensington gore. It's like paint. It's not the real thing.
It's not half so horrific in daylight again. You mentioned earlier, Ian, that the beginnings of this career in special effects started at art college and then on to Hammer Films, where you learnt the skills of your trade. Mm-hmm. Was this the real beginning of life for you?
Not really, John. No, I was one of those nasty little boys that, used to cut out paper skeletons and paper spiders and hide them in the wardrobe when I was about sort of 4 and 5, I can remember. I used to have a particularly nasty uncle that always used to get me to wash his car and everything, and the sooner that he went after the weekend, staying with my mother down in Gillingham, the happier I was. So I used to hide these sort of things in my aunt's wardrobe, and of course, she, being very neurotic, would take one look and off they would go. But in a more serious way, I suppose, as a kid, I was lucky enough to live in a lovely house down by the Strand in Gillingham, and it had an orchard, and of course this was paradise for children. And instead of playing inside the house, I obviously was always outside in the garden, and I used to build little model forts and little refineries out of odd bits and pieces, because at that time the Isle of Grain was beginning, and I had to have a miniature in the garden from all bits and pieces, old tin cans, and all my cars, little dinky cars were sort of around it. And I remember having a sort of volcano, which was really just earth piled up to the top of a candle. And then things got a little bit more ambitious, and I used to get little lighter fuel capsules and spray petrol over everything and then set fire to it. And great delight in watching my lead soldiers melt, which sounds terrible now, but again, it's back to this theatre thing. I didn't think of it as being real. And I used to look through an open matchbox. This to me was like looking through a camera. So, but I didn't know about cameras in those days. All I knew that when I went to the cinema and saw cartoons and things, which to me were very exciting, I was aware of the blackness around the outside of the screen. And I could get the same illusion by looking through a matchbox. And I suppose it all started from there. And I remember making a little camera that sat on a car, and that sort of, in my imaginary way of playing, that was filming everything that I was doing, as far as the models were concerned. There were all these sort of soldiers in forts, and the Indians would set fire to the fort, and all right, next day I'd have to rebuild another fort. So it was really like sort of making scenery, and which I do professionally anyway, in the sense of then burning it, and then you start again. And then when I was at art college, I was lucky enough to meet Duncan Rand, who still is an excellent actor and producer of places such as the Medway Little Theatre Club, and did a bit of the Globe, just sort of very crude sets, but it was all a sort of start. And then with display and photography at college, that held me in high stead later.
And your room has got a very macabre sense of decor. There's a very realistic-looking skull. You're dead. It's a very realistic skull peering over my shoulder somewhere at the moment. Try to think where it is. Now, this is not a mock-up. It's the real thing, isn't it?
Thing, yes. Well,
and you came by this in some very peculiar circumstances, I think.
Well, I don't know what the listeners are going to think, but I'm not really that bad, but it does sound bad when I keep sort of talking about sort of setting fire to lead soldiers and things. Again, having great, I don't know, I was inspired again at college by reading local cuttings about the coffins that used to pop up in the Medway from time to time, down on some marshland called Dead Man's Island, which is virtually opposite Queenborough, on some saltings there in the estuary. And remember my art master sort of saying that he would have thought this would have interested me, and of course it did. And the very next weekend I went on down there on my bicycle and walked across the marshes, and sure enough, you could just pick up bones out of the mud. And they were evidently Napoleonic prisoners, who I think I'm right in saying died of yellow fever, and they were put into the nearest bit of marshland to the boats by the Admiralty, and without any form of service, and it was unconsecrated ground. And there's not anything left there now, really, but in those days, when I was a kid, you could just go and pick up your bones, and then that's one of them. Francois.
You call it Francois?
I call it Francois.
Have you used it in any of your work at all?
Yes. I mean, most of the time nowadays it's easy to buy plastic skulls and bones and things. But no, he's been used. He featured in the film The Curse of Captain Clegg, which was a Hammer film about 1962. And he was painted with Kodak paint in those days to give a reflection in the camera. He came screaming up towards the audience as a sort of marsh phantom. It was a sort of Dr. Sin story, but we couldn't call it that because Disney had already made a film with Patrick McGowan in, and they'd got the copyright from Russell Thorndike, who of course was the brother to another local personality, sort of Dame... Sybil, of course, Dame Sybil Thorndike. And anyway, ours was The Curse of Captain Clegg, which the Hammer hierarchy thought would sell better than just Dr. Sin. And I think it was a successful picture. Again, in those days, I was with Les Bowie, who was in charge of the effects.
And again, this is where your, shall we say, kleptomania, is it? Your collecting of...
Yes.
It's coming very useful in your profession.
Yeah. Well, the last time he appeared was on one of the episodes of Churchill's People that the BBC put out last year. He was in ancient Britain in that one, being discovered in a peat bog by some Saxon diggers.
And Francois is almost holding hands with the top of Frankenstein's head, which is not actually one of the props you've used in your programmes,
no, that was purely for a fancy dress at the Albert Hall about 3 years ago.
Which stood you in good stead, I believe.
It did, yes, and I did rather well, and some champagne from that one. It was great fun. Pity that the old arts balls aren't held anymore, but I think that was the last one to be done on New Year's Eve 3 years ago.
And we spoke earlier of these horrible bats that are loafing around the room. We've also got some very hairy-looking spiders as well.
Yes.
How do you manage to sleep with all these fearsome creatures around?
Well, I think to get inspiration, I've always maintained that you can't get nightmares any better than eating cheese and pickled onions. And I love to have a nightmare. It's the most fascinating entertainment I can have, really. You know, sort of waking up in the middle of the night screaming, and you see something really nasty, and if you draw it straight away, you've got the inspiration for something later. Maybe. If not, then it's rather like writers do the same. They might have a dream and think that's a marvellous story. If only I'd written it down. And so instead of writing, I draw. I suppose a nightmare to me would be a sweet daffodil, wouldn't it?
Now, talking of drawing, you are a very accomplished artist as well.
Oh,
and
thank you, John.
I saw some of your work on the way up here this evening, or this afternoon. Is it evening now? I don't know.
Yes, it is. It's evening.
Oh, dear. But you've also telling me you did a series of paintings of the offshore radio ships of the mid-60s.
Yes.
And have gone to some very distinguished households.
Yes, well, I was out of work at the time. As I say, it's very much an up-and-down game, and you have to take the rough with the smooth. And there was no work at all in the film industry. It's one of the reasons, actually, that I went eventually to the BBC, which have been very good to me. I've been there for the last 6 years. But anyway, when the Pirates finished in '67, again I was slung to the four winds, and I thought, well, how do I make some money? So local interest with the pirate stations and so on, and I used to listen to them, and well, they were great, weren't they? They really were super.
They really were something.
But, so anyway, I did a series of pictures, as you said, and, well, then, all right, you've got 12 pictures, what do you do with them? Well, you try and sell them. And I was lucky enough to manage to get Tony Blackburn interested in Radio Caroline, of course, which was his starting place, and he later went on to Radio London, or was it the other way around? Perhaps it was the other way around.
It was Radio London second.
It was Radio London
Yep.
second. Well, anyway, he bought two of them. But John Aston, who lived in Maidenhead, he bought one. And the rest, unfortunately, I never know what happened to some of the DJs on stations such as Radio Essex. And I still had those up till a couple of weeks ago, and I gave them to a friend in Radio Medway. It's gone home to home, radio and radio.
Yes, indeed. You have a photograph in your one of your scrapbooks, and there's literally dozens here, but you have a photograph, of course, of Tony Blackburn's premarital flat, shall we describe it, with the two paintings.
Yes.
And I think we can all see they're really fine.
Well, I expect since he's been married, his wife has thrown them out.
Well, I certainly hope not. No, in great trouble. That really must be a collector's item by now. Of course, they're autographed by your good self, which comes up very well in the photo. Right, so what does the present and the future hold for you, Ian?
Well, at the moment, John, I'm engaged in getting a lot of new material for our exhibition in Blackpool on the front. Obviously, it's a Doctor Who exhibition because the children love this. I always find it's the adults that get scared of what this is. It's never the children. They love it. And that opens in Easter, and we're getting hold of all our old props and bits and pieces and renovating them. That's the ones that we haven't either blown up or set fire to. And this particular exhibition's been going on for 4 years, and every year we put in some new stuff and take out the old stuff. And that's on the Golden Mile. And all being well, in the middle of next February, I start yet another Doctor Who.
Now, there was some talk a short while ago in the papers about replacing the TARDIS, perhaps with a new style, a new shape.
Well, it's
developments
news
on
to me, actually, John. I hadn't heard that one.
It was the Sun newspaper, actually,
yes,
but
well,
unless this was a private opinion expressed by themselves.
Could well have been.
Because the TARDIS is getting pretty old, and
you got to remember there are
battered.
many different scriptwriters that contribute to these shows, and it might have been one particular scriptwriter's idea to bring in a new machine for his particular story. I must say that I hadn't heard about this myself. But I don't think it would be a bad idea, because let's face it, you don't see police boxes anymore. I suppose the nearest is the AA box or the RAC. I must mention the other ones. That's the nearest to a police box.
Have you any idea how this started off as a... I mean, this is the most unlikely thing. A police box is a time machine?
Yes. Well, it was Terry Nation's idea. I think the best person to ask is Terry. It was his original conception. He doesn't live too far away down in... near Sittingbourne, isn't it?
Of course, he was responsible for things like the survivors?
Yes, and the Daleks, of
The
course.
Daleks, of course.
But he didn't design them.
Although the credit does go to him
Yes,
for
well,
that.
he invented the word and had a rough idea what he wanted them to look like. This was all long before my time at the BBC, but the designer was Ray Cusack, who's still a designer at the Beeb, along with the special effects designer, who's now head of the department, Bernard Wilkie. And between them, they thrashed out something which was economical to make in numbers, and it was changed about 3 times before the finished article appeared. It's always strange, you know, John, that when you think up an idea for a monster, or a robot in this case, which, yes, let's call it a monster, how one will catch on with the public, and others might be far better in one way, but they don't connect with the children's mind to say, yes, we want to play Daleks, or whatever. And those really, we've never been able to beat them. They're still as popular as they were the day that they first started.
Yeah, because the Cybernauts were pretty good as well.
Yes, I think that they're only popular because they've been rewritten again into other shows, but they're not, you don't see little models of
They're not as
Cybernauts.
popular as Daleks, are they?
No.
Can you tell us a little about the forthcoming Doctor Who series? What will be the storyline on this one?
Not a lot, as they say at the moment, because I haven't seen the scripts, but all I know is it's to do with astrology and alchemists, and it's set in sort of medieval times, the times where they all tried to make gold, and Doctor Who goes back to that particular period. Of course, from our point of view, is slightly cheaper because it means that we can use a lot of our period costumes that are already in stock in the costume department. This is why sometimes the Doctor does disappear into our own past rather than an alien past on another planet. It means that we can air a lot of the costumes that have been used for such splendid dramas as Churchill's People, which I mentioned earlier. They can be used yet again on another series.
Who's going to be the chief... what's the word? The chief...
the Chief Nasty?
The Chief Nasty?
I don't know. As I say, I haven't seen the scripts. It's just tentative talk with the producer the other day, and he told me what I've told you. That's all I know at the moment.
That's really super.
But I hope that comes off in the middle of February.
I see also you're a very keen record collector.
Yes.
I almost hate to ask what your musical tastes are.
Well, as we've been talking about fantasy and this horrible word horror, which shouldn't be used but is, I think we'll have to finish with the Horror of Dracula, shall we say?
Oh, that sounds really first class.
Right.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian,
Thank
for
you,
sparing me
John.
the time.
Thanks.
Wish you all the best in the future of your career.
Thank you, John.